Greetings, welcome to the show. This is the overview, and I'm your host, Brother Mbogo. Today we're going to take a look at this idea, or this concept called the international order, or the Western idea of an international order, since prior to the Western excavations around the world, there was no international order as such. So the current situation, if you look at the war between Russia and Ukraine, as some say, has caused people to question how the world is structured and what's going to happen to the structure of the world in terms of the global order of things. For example, Russia, because of the sanctions put on it by the West in terms of removing it from the international payment system, this SWIFT system called the Society of Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. That's a SWIFT system where banks, the system banks use basically to make payments between each other, communications between each other. Russia has been removed from that system, so bank payments from Russia to other parts of the world has become almost impossible. Except for areas of the world which are friendly to Russia. Russia, back in 2015, began to work on a new system outside of this SWIFT system, and I think it's currently using that system to make trade with countries like China and those other countries in the global south. Apart from making individual agreements with countries such as China, I think also Iran, India, to do trade in their own currencies. So this SWIFT system is part of this so-called international order, which I'm going to detail later on. But also developments like the recent formation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, which would make Africa the largest free trade area in the world. And if played right or correctly, it will bring a lot of growth to the continent through trade within, if Africa takes advantage of the situation by producing more of the products on the continent rather than importing from outside. And then these products that we now produce on the continent can be traded within the continent itself. Also, China, as most people probably know, has become, some would argue, the largest economy in the world, or at least close to catching up with the US in terms of the size of its economy, or the GDP, as they call it, or gross domestic product. So this is seen as China becoming a challenge to the economic dominance of the US in the world. So people are wondering how, or you could wonder how, this is going to affect the world going forward. So anyway, let's take a look at, before we go into international order, the idea of an international order. So if you look at states like in pre-colonial Nigeria, for example, they had ethnic groups or tribes, you might call them, such as the Igbo, the Tiv, and the Izon. These were societies which didn't have a specific leader, but what they had were clans and groups of clans. Groups of clans would make up the tribe. And the decision-making processes, they would come together as a clan, and the clan heads would decide on the way forward in whatever matter that it might be. This is also a similar situation in North America before the Europeans arrived. There are quite a number of tribes which were what we would call stateless societies. These are societies without a specific leader. And the clans again would come together to make group decisions about the tribe. And it's one of the issues that disturbed the colonialists when they entered Africa, particularly regions like Nigeria, when they wanted to negotiate or talk with a particular tribe. They were looking to talk with one single head of the society, or one single leader, but they found they had to go and negotiate with several leaders, several clan leaders, or various communities in the one society, rather than just speaking to one leader. So what they did in the future, in fact, later on, was during the colonial periods, after they had colonized the regions, is create leaders in their society. So what you might find now, where certain tribes or cultural groups on the continent before didn't have a leader, now they seem to have leaders, seem to have a king or a chief, whereas in pre-colonial times, those societies didn't have a particular leader. It's a system created by the colonialists when they colonized those regions. This concept that a state without a specific leader is not a properly organized state is one of the notions that Europeans have, not just on a state level, but on the international level. For example, if states come together to agree, form some kind of coalition or some form of grouping, those groupings are still not looked on as organized properly in the European mindset. So anyway, let's get on to this idea of the international order. This concept developed in a recent sense, in the current sense, in terms of all regions of the world coming together to agree on some kind of structure. It's as a result of the European colonization process, European traversing around the world and occupying and colonializing and bringing regions of the world together under their idea of how the world should run. Or at the time, it was in their program of dominating regions of the world. So you have an international system in which Europeans have dominated several regions of the world, and you might call it, at the time, it would be an empire, like the British Empire, dominated certain regions of the world. Also, other countries in Europe had their so-called empires. After this structure began to, you could say, break down after the colonial period, even before the colonial period, I should say, the Europeans began to form structures of what they call an international order. So this order, let me see if I can find an interpretation of this concept of an international order. I'll come to it later on, but before this structure, there were what you might call economic orders, or orders based on trade, and then political orders based on particular regions of the world, bringing their societies together to trade or negotiate on political issues. So, for example, you have the fact that Asia and Africa used to trade as far back as 6,000 years ago. Ancient Rome traded silk with ancient China, and West Africa in the Middle Ages traded with could call it South America. This is detailed in the book by Ivan van Sertima, They Came Before Columbus. And in terms of political, or what you might call multipolar type regional structures, you had China's period of the 7 warring states. This was between the period 770 and 221 BCE. You had several, in fact it was one kingdom which split into 7 states. And these states would at times collaborate and form agreements. Other times they would be at war or in conflict. In West Africa, an example of this type of situation is with the Oso Confederation in northern Nigeria, where you had the Oso states, also 7 states, which in between 1500 and 1800 AD, also a similar situation where they would negotiate at some point or be in conflict or form some kind of agreements or some kind of confederation. And more recently, you have between 1815 and 1918, the Concert of Europe, formed after the Napoleonic War at the Congress of Vienna. This was a period where several European countries made peace and formed a form of organization in which they were, rather than go to war, they would sit down and discuss their differences before it reached the stage where they fall into conflict. So those are examples of regional orders which existed before the current international order. So this global order that I'm looking at today, or that existed, I should say, after the Napoleonic War and this formation of this concept of Europe, these European, by that time they were still colonial countries, they decided, being the most dominant or most powerful countries in the world as they saw themselves, they decided to expand their concept of Europe to involve other countries around the world and formulate a broader international order in which European powers would set the rules and regulation for that structure, and basically they would dominate the world, the way the world is run through this type of international order. So they formed the League of Nations in 1920, which later expanded, or it changed and adopted even more countries and made some other changes. One of the changes which came with the UN were the policies relating to the colonized regions, in which part of the UN Charter, it involved the idea that these colonial holdings or these colonized places would seek independence at some point. They would have to become independent countries at some point. So that was part of the UN Charter. In the League of Nations, there was some consideration for the colonized countries in terms of stewarding them to, or the colonial powers that were dominating these countries were supposed to look after the interests of the people within their colonies. But the UN took it a step further to implement a program of independence where these countries would now become independent. At the behest of one of the activities of the Pan-Africanists of the time, Kwame Nkrumah and so forth, was lobbying the United or the League of Nations to institute such a policy where these colonized areas would become independent. It's not something that we read about much, but it was some of the work that they were doing at the time, lobbying governments as well as the League of Nations to institute a program of independence for colonized regions. So this was adopted into the United Nations Charter when the United Nations began. So let's look at some models. I'm going to look at two models of the international order. In fact, there are the two main models. One is the realist order, then the liberal order. The realist model of an international order relates to anarchy again. In the realist model of the international order, the world is anarchic. It's disorganized in the sense that each state looks after its own interests, and cooperation and collaboration is limited to a certain extent that, or to the extent that a state will collaborate with another country or region, but it is always wary of the fact that it could actually end up at war with that same a neighbor or another country, the same country that it's trading with. It could end up in a warlike situation with it. So it can't be too dependent on such a country. So in terms of trade, you make sure that you trade in commodities that you're not going to be too dependent on that country for. For example, if you're looking at the arms trade or arms industry, a country would make sure that its arms interests or the commodities that are going into its arms making are not coming from a country that is a rival or a country that it knows it's likely to have some tensions with. So a real situation is where you're working on your own, you look after your own interests, and you're careful of who you collaborate and trade with. It's one of the ideas behind stockpiling of weapons, countries stockpiling their weapons just in case of a war situation. In a liberal order, the liberal order is based on the term liberalism. Let me define it. For the liberal international order is defined based on the idea that the configuration of the international arena changes according to the intrastate power structures. So that the power structures between states changes how the liberal order is organized. And it's based on the idea of liberalism. The idea of liberalism is based on the individual and the achievement of individual rights. and individual freedoms. So the ideas such as the individual's right to own property, freedom to make their own decisions, and such forth. So in terms of countries should be able to define their own path on the international level. So although within the liberal order, there's trade and cooperation is promoted, as trading and cooperating with other countries could also benefit the individual country. But the concept of individualism in society itself, if you look at, for example, at the family, in terms of the husband and wife, and now the Western idea of how a family should be, in terms of, in many societies, traditional or even current societies, you find that it's the role of the man to be a provider, in a sense. Well, both provide, and then the woman stays at home, and she has a role in looking after the children. Also, in traditional society, she would also be growing food. But in Western societies, the woman stays at home, the man makes all of the money. So it has almost created a competitive mindset that the woman also wants to go out there. And the role of the man is seen as something greater than the role of the woman. It's a European Eurocentric idea that, to the extent that promotes the male more than the female role in life or position in life. So even the females in this society wants to be a so-called achiever, whereas the role at home, or in terms of caring and guiding the life of the child, is played down in Western societies. That's why you find situations like the children have a lot less respect for their parents in Western societies, or their behavior towards their parents is less controlled than in traditional societies. And that is also the right of the child. The child is, to some extent, given more freedom in Western society. Corporal punishment, parents punishing their children in certain ways, is now seen as something that is not good in Western society, which to some extent emboldens children to turn against their parents. And you have ideas such as divorce and abortion. These are divorce in traditional society is almost not heard of. There would always be a way to reconcile or sort out the problem without the family separating. But because of the individualist mindset of Western societies, if any disagreement takes place, or one party, either the husband or wife, is aggrieved in some way, divorce is more or less promoted as a solution. And these ideas of individual rights are promoted as universal concepts or rights which should be enjoyed by the whole world. It's a Western idea developed for Western societies, but in the idea of the United Nations or in the concepts or Charter of the United Nations, you find these are the ideas that are promoted for the whole world to adopt, you could say. So I'm going to, apart from these two ideas of the international order, I'm going to look at rights now, although we've touched on rights already. So this is rights and individualism. So a right is defined as a justifiable entitlement to something by virtue of the possession of a relevant attribute against an agent or agents with the corresponding obligation to meet that right. So the right is as an entitlement which another party has the duty or obligation to meet that right. So if the individual in the society has a right to work or a right to education and so forth, then it's up to the state to provide a situation where the people can enjoy their rights. So the state has to provide an environment where businesses can thrive and produce jobs, or create jobs, so that those who are looking for work can work. or the state is supposed to provide an education system so those who are entitled to education can be educated. Which is fine, that is fine to a certain degree, but in traditional societies it is also up to the individual to look for means of providing a living. In this current society, you'll find that it's all about going out and looking for work. But in a traditional society, you become almost an innovator, producing the work yourself. It wasn't a mass production society as it is today, where you find a lot of not cheap labor, but mass production labor, low skilled work. For anybody looking to make a living, you just go and look for a job, doing something menial which you may not even have any interest in, rather than finding something that you can enjoy and do to make a living. So the duties are placed on society to provide circumstances for the individual to exercise their right. But in traditional society, the individual also had a duty. Duties to family, duties to society. So you'd fit more within a family and clan structure rather than going out into the world as an individual to find your way. So the rights of an individual in traditional society were defined in relation to a group. The collective took preeminence, as I was saying, over the individual. So the individual has the freedom to enjoy their rights in the context as long as they contribute to the group and preserving the common good and the common norms and morals of the society. So individualism promotes, to some extent, moving away from the norms and morals of a society. So if you feel like going a particular way, you as an individual should have that right, even if it goes against the norms of the society. Asia has a similar idea to Africa, though Asia is becoming more westernized as it has developed much quicker than Africa. And this development is not accidental. It involves the collusion of the West, or the pushing of the West for Asia to become a developed economy, but I'll discuss that another time. So the UN Charter, which promotes these rights, although involved in developing the Charter on Human Rights were Chinese, Lebanese, and South American scholars. So even though these scholars from different regions of the world were involved in the Charter development, it still very much leans towards an individualistic framework. The next concept of rights I'm going to look at is the right to intervene. This is another human rights concept developed around 1815, around the time of the Napoleonic War, where the European powers saw the need to intervene in their what was happening in their neighboring countries, whether to prevent a massacre or prevent something from spilling over into their own countries. But this concept, the concept that seems genuine. If there's about to be an atrocity or something, or genocide taking place in a country, it would seem to be okay to intervene to prevent that genocide from taking place. But you will find that countries can also abuse that resolution or policy, UN policy, to intervene for their own purposes, such as the situation that we found in Libya in 2011, when UN Resolution 1973 was used to protect citizens from harm from the Libyan, so-called harm from the Libyan government. It wasn't a resolution used for invasion. It's just to prevent an atrocity from taking place. So it's basically to prevent the threat of attack. This policy was used to bomb Libya. Countries such as the US, Canada, Britain, and France bombed Libya, and basically they got rid of the Libyan government under the pretext that Gaddafi was about to cause harm to his people. But the real threat to the European powers, I could say, is that Gaddafi wanted to create an African currency, Africa's own currency. And for example, France would have lost out if this currency was created, because the French-speaking nations were using a French currency, and their bank reserves were kept in France. So if you bring an African currency and then the reserves are no longer kept in France but kept in West Africa in this instance, then that would be a threat to the French finances or the French economy. In terms of the US, since Gaddafi was talking about no longer buying oil or selling oil in dollars, but moving again to an African currency, but before that to the euro, the US also saw that as a threat. So Gaddafi's ideas for the continent were maybe a threat to Western interests. So that was one of there are many others, but that is an example of the misuse of this concept or this policy of responsibility to protect. It can be invoked by certain powers to suit their own interests. So that's rights, the two ideas of rights. Let's look at democracy itself. This idea of democracy, which is also promoted by the United Nations, the idea of democracy itself is okay. People being contributing or being involved in the running of their society or country. But certain models of democracy, you might say, or certain features of democracy which the West promotes as universal or global, are really Western ideas of democracy, such as the elections process, this competition between different groups, or the multi-party political system where two parties vie for leadership of a country and you have to vote for one or the other through secret ballot elections. That's very much a Western idea of selecting a government. So this idea that almost a competition between two parties, two groups to lead a country, and the people vote. The one gets the highest amount. If one gets 50% and the other gets 45%, the one with the 5% advantage now wins, rather than people finding a way of deciding through consensus, rather than having a winner and a loser in the political process. It's not just in political. There are many instances where this type of selection is used. But in a traditional governance, in traditional societies, it wasn't about electing through voting. It was about selecting through consensus. And some societies, even though there was no voting process, you had a king, for example, who was hereditary, and the parliament of ministers was selected. There were ways of making sure that they did what they were supposed to do. The people still had a say in the running of the system. In fact, even more so than this current Western system, where it seems people don't have much of a say, as the rich and wealthy are a small minority of society. And unless there's some war or some drastic action, it's not likely to change in the near future. And in Ethiopia, for example, you have the Oromo people with their Abagada system. It's an age-set system where elders who run the society are rotated every 8 years. So this is another type of system where you rotate leadership rather than having a competitive system of selecting leaders. So let's lastly look at this idea of unipolarity. A unipolar world is one in which there's one dominant state. There's a concept called hegemonic stability theory, which states that having a dominant economic state in the world helps to maintain the stability of the international order. So having one dominant country in the global economy for existence is supposed to create stability, as having one dominant power there overseeing and almost in control of the situation is seen as an advantageous situation to be in. Well, coming from those who run or would like or run such a system, they're bound to argue that it's a beneficial system. So technically, a unipolar world is one in which one state enjoys a preponderance of power and faces no competitor state. That is almost what the US was in the 90s. Some argue around the 90s up to around 2000, 2001. The world was a unipolar world, and slowly it has been moving away from a unipolar situation as China has been growing. China in particular, but then you also have Russia. So these dominant features that these states have, for example, if you look at the US, the US is a dominant economy. It's seen to be an economy that other states want to copy and be like the US. That's why you have much of the Western fashions around the world. Well, it started before this with colonialism. But looking at the US way of dressing, US foods in terms of chips, burgers, pizzas, those ideas are all around the world now. So the social culture of the dominant state is seen to be something to be copied or mimicked by those societies who want to grow economically. Even the political system is seen as something that's advantageous in that for a society to be successful, it has to supposedly imitate the type of state that Western countries have. Notwithstanding the fact that there are also secret programs by structures within the US and the Western world itself to make sure that countries follow that line of political development. If not, you will know that many socialist type countries face a lot of sabotage strategies from the US. You look at Cuba, for instance. Cuba is a country that is seen as an enemy to the US because it at one time supported Russia or the USSR and adopted a socialist political system. So those countries that don't adopt the system that Western countries have, or political system that Western countries have, are either sanctioned, they're denigrated, seen as societies which are dictatorial, or the societies that don't treat their citizens correctly, basically. All right, to summarize, yes, looking at the world as it is, I've not gone into the fact that many of the countries which now exist, let's look at Africa, for example, are colonial structures created so that the Western powers could restructure the continent to their liking. As before this restructuring, there are many kingdoms and what you would call states. In fact, there were states with their leadership and governmental structures. These were almost discarded, and although they still exist, their political power was taken away when the colonial powers came in and created their own borders, grouping states, several states into one country or one territory, and creating a governmental structure to oversee those territories and disenfranchising the governments or societies that existed or still exist. There are many traditional kingdoms and societies that still exist, but they have no political power. Anyway, the African Union itself, in terms of, if we look at this continental free trade area, is the first stage, some argue that, of unifying the continent so that the continent will have one president. Although, as I said, this unifying of the continent would still disenfranchise traditional societies as they have lost political power and they're unlikely to regain that political autonomy. And another question that could be asked about the AU, the EU, even the Arab League or Arab Union, is it not part of this globalist structure or agenda to unify all regions in the world under a so-called global government based on, there's talk of a global government based on an individualistic idea of societies where the individual is more important than the family or the clan or the collective. And the next stage from that, from individualizing the human, even the male-female has been individualized to the extent that the male and female role in life and family is becoming almost indistinguishable. So the creation of this so-called transhumanist world, where you move past being just a human and moving towards even combining humans with machine to make what they call cyborgs. That's the futuristic idea of what's happening to the world, or what's going to happen to the world. But anyway, that's an overview of the idea of the international order, an order based on European concepts such as rights and our democracy, the methods of our society or government is supposed to be organized, and the idea of the humans in terms of the individual instead of a family. So that was the overview.